What I can tell you is that on Saturday, March 5th, the United States military conducted airstrikes in Somalia against Raso Camp, a training facility of al-Shabaab.
As many as 150 suspected Islamic fighters are reportedly killed by a U.S. strike in Somalia, part of what some are calling America's invisible war. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. What took place over the weekend in Somalia is part of what is known in the West as the global war on terror, many aspects of which are part of an invisible campaign led by the U.S. to neutralize Islamic insurgents wherever they may be. The United States says that last year Special Operations Forces deployed a record-shattering 147 countries. That's 3/4 of all existing nations. Their mission ranged from killing or capturing insurgents to training exercises. Later, we'll talk with a former member of the U.S. Foreign Service and a former CIA covert operations officer. But we begin in our newsroom with CCTV's Sean Calebs. And Sean, how does what took place in Somalia fit into this larger U.S. operation?
Well, I really think you can't talk about one without talking about the other, because what happened about 200 kilometers north of Mogadishu in the eastern African nation of Somalia is a pretty good microcosm of what has happened in the United States over the past 15 years in the war of terrorism. U.S. military officials say they had a pretty unique opportunity at this training camp, Raso Camp. There were a number of al-Shabaab militants, apparently in some kind of military graduation ceremony or something like that, and that is when U.S. drones and fighter jets moved in and dropped their bombs on the area, killing as many as 150 al-Shabaab militants. The United States has gone out of its way to say they don't believe any civilians were killed in that. We really have no idea, because as you talked about in this invisible war, it's really difficult to track exactly what special forces, special ops are doing. And the reason we talk about special forces and special ops in something like what happened in just north of Mogadishu is because we're told that it was special forces who were monitoring the situation, and they said it became apparent that the al-Shabaab group was apparently on the verge of some kind of imminent strike, either against U.S. forces on the continent of Africa or some other target within Africa.
Right, and if we look at the broader war, the number of countries the U.S. is operating in is staggering. We mentioned those numbers. How did it get to this point?
It really is staggering, and it has become the norm for the U.S. military. If you think back before 9/11, there were 23 terrorist organizations listed under the United States military. Well, today there are more than 1,000. So after 9/11, once the war on terror, and they began to go after, if you remember very clearly what President George W. Bush said, we're coming after you dead or alive. If you support this kind of terrorism, or if you harbor these kind of terrorists. And so that really kind of set the tone. And you talked about the numbers. They're simply staggering. 140 some countries, 75 or 80% of the countries throughout the world, in places like Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan and Yemen. Of course, you certainly expect U.S. Special Forces to be on the ground. They've had military operations in and around those areas for some time. But some of the other nations might surprise you. Jordan, the special ops are there. Niger, throughout Latin America, Central America. So that's really what has come down to this. And it is a changing military. Think back on the first attack against Saddam Hussein in Desert Storm. 400,000 or 500,000 troops lined up in the desert. You really don't see that anymore. What you see right now are the kind of troops that they can put together in small teams, the kind that went after Osama bin Laden. And that is really what we're talking about. If perhaps the 1950s and 60s were the golden age of espionage during the height of the Cold War, then what people are saying now is this is the golden age for special forces. They're given a great deal of autonomy. And President Obama, who proclaimed himself the anti-war president, has really ramped this up during his 8 years in office.
Okay, Sean, thanks a lot. That's CCTV's Sean Calebs reporting. Well, let's get now to our distinguished panel. Joining us from France is Frank Romano. He's a professor of law, history, and Middle East studies at the University of Paris. With us here in Washington is Benjamin Friedman. He focuses on defense and homeland security as a research fellow with the Cato Institute. Peter Van Buren is an author and former U.S. Foreign Service officer. He joins us from New York, and with us from Phoenix, Arizona is Mike Baker, a counterterrorism expert. He spent 17 years as a CIA covert operations officer. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with Mike in Arizona. Mike, no doubt that the United States and its allies, as well as other countries, face grave threats from groups like Al-Shabaab. So we have this war being waged, this invisible secret war. Question is it working?
Well, like so many other aspects of the counterterrorism program, it's a very complex and not a clear answer that I'm about to give. It's relatively unsatisfactory. So the answer is not 100% it's working, not 100% it's not working. It's very layered. The drone program that we started off this show talking about in this attack that took place on Al-Shabaab, as an example, that drone program has expanded significantly during the course of President Obama's administration. But in concert with other elements of the counterterrorism program, primarily our work with our liaison partners, significantly our efforts to try, and it's an ongoing process, to try to reach out to Muslim communities, both here in the U.S. and with our allies, to counteract the social media efforts. All these things together, yes, they can work, but if all we do is expand and rely on a drone program, on this behind-the-scenes effort, because God forbid we should commit again to ground troops somewhere in a significant way, then the answer would be no, it wouldn't be particularly efficient.
Right, Peter, what do you think? Is the U.S. and its allies winning this war? And let me add one other point. Is the threat being reduced, or does this war, as we've just seen in the drone strikes, actually make the threat even bigger?
Sure. Let's take a look at the last 15 years since 9/11. The United States has gone to war in one form or another with dozens, if not hundreds, of different locations. You yourself stressed that 3/4 of the nations on Earth have U.S. Special Forces active in them. We have conducted full-scale wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've conducted medium-scale wars in Libya, now in Syria, and we've conducted ongoing special forces and drone attacks all over the now militarized continent of Africa. It's very difficult to claim that anything good has really come of that, certainly not on a large scale. Al-Qaeda may be tamped down, but ISIS sprung up to take their place. Somalia, which was always an unstable place, is now a source of export of terrorism. Kenya, their neighbor, which used to be stable, is now subject to attacks. There's just nothing to suggest that any progress has been made, and in fact, extraordinary amounts of empirical information, i.e. the last 15 years, to suggest that things have gotten much worse, with no end in sight.
Frank, as Peter just said, no end in sight. Is this a war without end? I mean, will there be a time when the United States can raise the flag of victory and say, victory is ours, we have prevailed?
Well, I'm going to key on what Mike said. This counterterrorism, I want to make it clear, I'm not against the idea of counteracting the social media and other attempts. One of the choices is to use this secret bombing through drones. But what's happening, it's almost like a never-ending vicious cycle, and this is where it gets scary, and I'm going to play a bit of the devil's advocate here. With the bombing of the drones, in particular, for instance, even 3 days after Obama took over, there was the bombing in Yemen, or at least in the South Waziristan area, and a tribal leader. There were Al-Qaeda victims. Then a tribal leader's house was bombed, and the whole family was killed, and there was a mistake there. What is happening? This vicious cycle is from the mistakes that are being made. And again, President Obama and the Special Forces are saying we're taking all the efforts we can to not make mistakes and zero on targets, but it doesn't look like such meticulous efforts have been made. Many innocent people have died. And what is that doing? That's ratcheting up the recruiting by these terrorist groups. I think they even welcome these mistakes, unfortunately innocent victims dying, and then turning around, and now we see boots on the ground. So it's a vicious cycle, boots on the ground to counteract a lot of the growing terrorism that I think in some part are being enhanced by some of our anti-terrorist activities, such as the mistakes that are made by the drones. There's not enough meticulous efforts are being made. And secondly, and I think in the Benghazi fiasco manifests that, and the president and Mr. Schiff, Democrat from California, I think manifest the White House position. They want to switch the control of the drones from the CIA to the Pentagon because they've taken a lot of CIA out of the field. And what they're implying or saying is that if the CIA were on the field of Benghazi, most likely would have foreseen what was going on there a lot in the drone rooms and get them back to gather information, which their main role is.
Okay. Ben, let me ask you this. What do you make of the fact that this war is being conducted largely in secrecy? I mean, we don't know what is happening and what is being done in the name of the United States. I mean, the standard answer when you pose these questions is, what we're doing is in the interest of national security. It's not in the interest to publicly disclose these facts. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, in Somalia, with this strike, which killed 150 people, which is really unprecedented in terms of scale for a drone attack, we don't know anything but what our government told us, basically, about the strike. They say the Al-Shabaab was going to imminently attack not just Kenyans, African Union troops, but also the U.S. forces that are there in small numbers. But we have no evidence of that. And the reason we have no evidence of that, as is the case with these other places where we're doing drone strikes where we have very little information, is because we have no real debate about it. We have no oversight. We have no checks and balances. We've had one authorization of military force in 2001 that's become the legal warrant for 15 years of drone strikes on groups that, however much they might have ideological sympathy with al-Qaeda, are totally different operationally. So if we had some congressional debate, some oversight hearings on this, we might get a little more information and not just have to take the administration's word for everything.
But there are congressional oversight committees.
Right. Yeah, there are committees, but they don't hold hearings, really. I mean, there's because these wars involve casualties only on the receiving end of the strikes. I think Congress is more or less disinterested. They've sort of lost their war powers or become disinterested in exercising their war powers, and I think that makes us a little dumb in how we formulate public policy.
Mike, I want to get back to a point that Frank just raised a moment ago. I mean, critics of the U.S. drone program say that it's actually counterproductive because it defeats the purpose. Attacks are indiscriminate, civilians are killed, women and children are killed, and the United States is making more enemies than actually conquering, than conquering the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's no doubt that civilians have been killed in these attacks. The White House is looking to release some reporting on that to try to provide some level of transparency around this. Another aspect of this, though, is that, look, there's a tendency, I think, over the past several years to rely heavily on the drone campaign, on the drone program, in part because of the president's desire to pull the troops back, to get away from this anti-war stance that he started out on. But I think what he's realized is you still have to go after those high-value targets when they're available. This is a painstaking process. Nobody should be under the impression somehow that you just identify a target and then you push a button and you go. There's a very elaborate and labor-intensive risk versus gain process that goes on in this drone program. Ultimately, though, the decision is made on these attacks in the White House to do this. Now, the problem I've got with it from an operational perspective is not so much this idea that it fuels the anti-American sentiment, that it continues to feed in. And no doubt there's an element of that. I'm not disagreeing with that. But my perspective, because of my experience that I bring to this, is that if from an operational perspective, we are not focused, as we used to be, on actually obtaining or detaining high-value targets off the battlefield. It has become almost a situation where we're more inclined to kill them rather than try to pick them up. And if we don't pick them up, the pipeline of potential operational intelligence, actionable intelligence, dries up. And that's where we've gotten to, because in part I feel as if this administration the last thing they want to do is pick up more detainees and have to house them in Gitmo, as an example, or deal with the mess that is having high-value detainees. So it's almost as if on the battlefield, the mentality is, let's just paint the target and take them out, rather than go through a process when possible. And they have, I'm not diminishing the fact that they have picked up a handful, but not anywhere near like what we used to. If you don't have that actionable intelligence, if you don't have the detainees, then part of this is, yes, it does feed on itself. You don't get the intelligence that may allow you to do something other than drone a target.
Peter, what do you make of that? You know, as Mike says...
That contradicts what President Obama is saying, that if we can pick them up, we do that. In practice, I think that's right. I think it's become a low priority, less of a problem, and then going into the drones, and we see what the consequences of that, and I think that's a huge mistake. And we see again the terrorist groups profiting from that, using propaganda and recruiting hundreds based upon some of the errors that we've made, that some of them could have been avoided by picking them up, taking the time to do it, and conforming to what Mr. Obama has been saying that is our priority, which I don't think in practice is true.
Okay, Peter, I will get to you in a moment, but I'm going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the deployment of U.S. Special Forces in the global war on terror. Let's get back to our panel. Peter, just getting back to what Mike said earlier on, some kind of analysis is done when the Pentagon and the White House looks at the high-value targets that they want to go after. But if you look at some kind of risk-benefit analysis, where does that put us?
Well, I think we want to step back for a second and look at this from the outside, meaning everywhere else in the world except the United States. In the last 15 years, the United States has unilaterally declared that we are entitled to send troops, special forces, aircraft, drones, whatever we determine is sufficient, to kill people in countries all around the world who we decide deserve to die. This becomes the question of radicalization that just simply can't be dismissed as a talking point here. Whether we're talking about kidnapping people out of their countries, or whether we're talking about killing them in their countries, and whether we're talking about killing only bad guys as if that was magically possible, or if we're understanding that we're also killing lots and lots of collateral people, we have to ask, how can this not create more terrorists? How can we not, in a region of the world in particular where revenge culture is very important, not be creating more bad guys? And if you're still not sure of the answer to that, I simply refer you back to the last 15 years. In the initial stages of the Afghan campaign, for example, and in Iraq, we picked up lots and lots of high-value targets and questioned them and interrogated them. And yet, here we are, 15 years later, and we're still playing whack-a-mole with these same people in the same places, as well as an expanded network of places around the world. You're left to wonder if, in fact, this is not a perpetual war simply because we insist on perpetuating it, because we can't think of a better answer than to keep sending our drones around the world to kill people. As far as social media, which, I'm sorry, two gentlemen have mentioned earlier, I think we want to be very careful about sort of magic wanding all this radicalization away and blaming Twitter. If a drone strike does not radicalize someone, it's very difficult to imagine that they would be influenced by 140 characters.
Right. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to say that the implication in that statement, though, is that if we don't, in part, have some proactive element to a counterterrorism strategy, and if we just stopped going after confirmed bad guy targets, that's a simplistic way to put it, then the problem would go away, and we'd all be holding hands, and everybody would be living in a peaceful community of nations, and the Muslim extremist problem would dry up because we're not taking any action when warranted to protect our national security concerns.
Well, I don't think anybody's hands and singing Kumbaya. I think what we're talking about is achieving a measure of stability that does not require us to set fire to whole regions of the earth. Keep in mind
but that's a rather extreme statement to say set fire to whole regions of the earth. I mean, we have to keep it focused and talk about it in reasonable, rational terms.
How else would you describe the situation across northern Africa, into the Levant, into Iraq, and soon certainly to spread in other parts of the Middle East? It's difficult to call that much else. I think the other thing that needs to be...
But I would argue that I think the Arab Spring had something to do with the fact that we've got a significant amount of chaos. Look, I don't disagree with you in the sense that we've got 6, maybe 7 failed states in the Middle East right now.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm not in the camp that says we absolve Muslim extremists of all problems here, and it's our fault somehow for wanting to protect ourselves. Look, terrorism, this problem didn't exist. It didn't just pop up around 9/11 or around our invasion of Iraq.
Okay.
This has been going on for a long time.
Right. Ben, let me get to you. Your institute, the Cato Institute, has published some figures which I've been looking at. It says that in the first quarter of 2015, special forces were deployed in more than 80 countries. There are critics of this, the fact that the United States is deployed in so many countries. One of the critics, Linda Robinson of the RAND Corporation, says that the high number of deployments is a mistake. What is needed is a more focused, more thoughtful deployment of special forces like we have seen in Colombia or in the Philippines. What do you think?
Well, I think, number one, I think we can be a little confused by the raw numbers when there's, a relatively small number of special operations forces doing a training mission or something. It's sort of different than a hot mission where they're going on a raid, Delta Force raid or a Navy SEAL raid or a drone strike. So I think, the situations where we're using lethal force are relatively limited, probably too many in my view. But I think whether it's drones or special operations forces, there's a tendency of the United States to believe that we have a magic wand. We have a magic wand with air power or a bunch of guys who are so well trained that we can sort of avoid the human and financial costs of war and just send in a small group of people and solve our problems. And I think we've been for a long time in the United States subject to this kind of dream that there's some sort of magic wand technological solution from the air or with a small group of people, and the history of it is pretty bad, and drones haven't changed that. I think one thing to point out following on the discussion is it's very difficult to say how well this stuff is working. There's so few studies. I mean, our government in some ways is guilty of not making even minuscule efforts, at least in the public sphere, to say, this is how we judge if this is working or not. This is our cost-benefit analysis. We don't see hardly any of that. So I think, that's one more reason to have a debate, that some of that information might leak out or come out in a public forum if we debated it more.
Frank, when we look at this...
let me invite you simply... Anand, you shared with us the idea of let's go to the sources. And I'm saying, well, I believe the use of anti-terrorist application, especially through the drones, is more of a band-aid approach. It's a drastic approach for pretty much of a drastic foreign policy, and it's precisely the Iraq fiasco, pretty much, and that's created a real void there to make up for our fiascos. Not working with the neutral Syrians that requested our aid 2 years ago. Now, since Americans don't want boots on the ground, Obama, of course, following that policy through technical warfare, machine warfare, so we don't have boots on the ground, is simply a band-aid policy to a very much failed foreign policy, the source of the problems. And Nan, I think you stated that, and I think we're all getting to that, is revamping our foreign policy, working with these countries, working with the neutrals. There were non-aligned Syrians that wanted to work with us, and now the president comes out recently and saying we've got to help them. They've been integrated with some of the rebel groups that are either in charge of, headed by al-Nusra or al-Qaeda. Where do you find them? Well, it's a little bit too little too late. Well, let's make up for it now. We're going to help the Kurds. The Iraqi army is not doing so hot, but then we'll make up for it through the drones.
Okay, Peter, what's the alternative to this? I mean, does a country like the United States say, okay, this is not working, what we've got to do now is send in, engineers, builders, plumbers, bricklayers, and say, this is the way we're going to beat this?
Sure. I mean, the most important lesson that we have forgotten in the last 15 years is that the United States has a very large toolbox. We've only been using basically one tool, the military, expanded through the CIA paramilitary and expanded through the use of private contractors. We've only been using a single tool. Our attempts to do what, for example, the Chinese have done in Africa have failed in other places because of implementation. But right now, the most common American for someone to encounter overseas, at least in the third world, is going to be wearing a uniform. We have diplomacy, we have economic aid, we have building projects, we have a range of tools that the United States needs to pick out of the toolbox and employ. Some will work better in some areas, and I absolutely agree. There are places where military power has a very specific role and can be used very effectively. But simply to decide that because we have a big hammer, everything needs to be struck down, well, that brings us right to where we are today, 15 years later, and we haven't solved a single problem, and we've probably created a whole lot more along the way.
Mike, is that a better idea? To use the other tools in the toolbox, economic aid, for instance?
Well, I think to use them more efficiently and more effectively, sure. Again, this is neither. It's not an either-or situation. Yep. It's not like we're not trying to do some of that, or that this administration has not been trying to use economic aid and other influences, or you know, the NGOs that exist out there. So. But I do definitely agree. Yeah, you can't just take a ball-peen hammer and use that as your solution every time you're dealing with this problem. And I do agree that we need to be able to multitask. And sometimes I worry that we're not able to do that. We seem to have somehow over the years gotten away from the ability to think about this in a more complex way. And so, yes, we need to do all that. We need to take everything that's in that kit bag, and if that means occasionally that means a drone strike, if occasionally that means putting our special forces out there, if that means financial aid, yes, but that's true. A more effective, complex approach.
Okay, Ben, very quickly.
Well, I just wanted to dissent from the idea that I'm sensing from the other panelists here, that there's this massive problem around the world from failed states and chaos that we have to fix with one tool or another, or else we're going to have horrible security problems. I think that's basically false. The threat of terrorism remains quite small for most Americans. You're more likely to die drowning in your bathtub, statistically speaking. As terrible as it is to live in a country where there's a civil war, which is where most terrorism comes from, it doesn't necessarily affect us halfway around the world unless we stick our nose in it. That's been the historical experience. So are there problems we need to solve and uses for drone strikes and special operations forces? Yes, but we're pretty safe here in the United States, and I think we need to keep that in mind. And I don't think we should be hubristic that we have the magic powder in the State Department to fix these problems either.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. Thank you very much.